A millionaire, blinded by love, failed to see the web of cruelty his wife wove around his aging father. In the oppressive silence of Ashworth Manor, the old man suffered in isolation, while a raven, witness to every humiliation, prepared a dark and unexpected vengeance. The silence at Ashworth Manor was an orchestra of whispers, not of voices, but of absence. Absence of warmth, of frank conversations, of laughter. George felt it as a weight on his chest in his room, once vibrant with memories of a full life, now a forced sanctuary. The heavy curtains, which Eleanor insisted on keeping closed to protect the furniture from the sun, also blocked out the outside world, transforming mornings into perpetual twilight. The air seemed denser there, imbued with the smell of mildew and despair. He tried to reach for the water jug on the bedside table, but his fingers trembled. A drop trickled down the glass, wetting the polished wood. A small slip, but one that Eleanor would make seem like an act of sabotage. For weeks her visits had a single purpose: to inspect the dust, the order, and above all, George's compliance. A soft scratching at the window caught his attention. Shadow, the raven with lustrous feathers, landed on the sill, tilting his head with an almost human curiosity. His black eyes, deep as the darkness of night, seemed to absorb everything, every detail of the silent misery that reigned in that room. George felt a fleeting relief in the animal's presence, a brief pause in the loneliness that consumed him. The bedroom door opened without warning, and Eleanor entered, slender and impeccable in her silk dress. A polished smile adorned her lips, but her eyes, an icy blue, swept the room like a scanner. "Father George," she began, her voice melodic but with an undertone of iron, "I see you didn't feel well enough for breakfast again. Edward will be worried." She approached the small table, her gaze fixed on the damp stain. "Oh, how careless. Don't worry, I'll clean it myself." Eleanor took a silk handkerchief from her pocket and wiped the water with a calculated gesture of patience and martyrdom. "You know, Father, the house is large. Keeping everything in order demands a lot from me. If only you could help us a little more. Or perhaps reconsidering some of your financial decisions would make everyone's life easier." George felt a chill. There it was, the familiar refrain. With every concern for his health came the insinuation about his assets, the lands he still owned, the investments Eleanor coveted. He tried to form a response, but his throat was dry. "It's only for your own good, Father," Eleanor continued, her voice now a little firmer, less melodic. "With the assets in Edward's name, we could ensure you had the best treatment without worries, without the need to get out of bed, for example." The last sentence was laden with a subtle weight, a veiled threat. Outside the window, Shadow let out a low, almost inaudible croak and flapped his wings. He seemed to be registering the tone, the inflection, the dark promise embedded in Eleanor's words. At that moment, Edward appeared at the door, radiant. "My love, I'm ready for golf. And Father, is everything all right here?" He didn't notice the tension in the air, only the image of his solicitous wife beside his elderly father. Eleanor turned to her husband with the sweetest smile, erasing the coldness from her eyes. "My dear, Father George is a little indisposed, but I'm already taking care of him. Just a small accident with the water." She cast a quick glance at George, a silent warning not to contradict her. "He needs absolute rest, doesn't he, Father?" George merely nodded, words trapped. He felt like a puppet, his invisible strings in his daughter-in-law's hands. Edward, relieved, gave his father a quick kiss on the forehead. "Get well soon, Father. Eleanor is taking good care of you." As Edward and Eleanor left, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the corridor, George closed his eyes. The silence returned, but now it was filled with the echo of Eleanor's words, with the shadow of her threats. Shadow, the raven, watched from the window. his eyes fixed on the door through which the woman had disappeared. A hoarser croak escaped his throat, a sound strangely similar to a harsh whisper. The lesson was being learned, note by note, gesture by gesture. The final performance was being rehearsed. The silence that returned to George's room after Eleanor and Edward left was denser than before, laden with the weight of implicit threats. George squeezed his eyes shut, feeling exhausted, a broken doll after a forced scene. Each day, the walls of his isolation seemed to shrink a little more, suffocating him in the mansion's gloomy opulence. Shadow outside flapped his wings once, letting out a deep croak that for an instant seemed like an echo of Eleanor's sharp voice. The raven did not fly away. His keen eyes continued to fix on the closed door as if waiting for the next act of the cruel play. The hours dragged on. The afternoon meal, an insipid broth and dry bread, was left by a young maid whose downcast eyes and hurried movements betrayed the fear she felt for the lady of the house. George barely touched the food. Physical hunger was eclipsed by an emotional nausea. Later, a pale sunbeam managed to pierce the dense curtains, revealing dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. George tried to get up, feeling his muscles ache and weakness in his legs. He needed air, light, something to remind him of the vibrant world he had once inhabited. But the idea of being caught by Eleanor, of facing another interrogation disguised as concern, was a powerful deterrent. He retreated to bed, the weight of silence falling upon him again. The sound of footsteps in the corridor, firmer this time, made his heart leap. It wasn't Eleanor's light tread. The door opened and Edward entered, a look of concern on his usually jovial face. "Father, how do you feel? Eleanor told me you're not eating properly." Edward sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting briefly on George's, a gesture that once would have been comforting but now seemed superficial. George tried to seize the opportunity. "Edward, my son, I need a little air, perhaps a walk in the garden." His voice was a hoarse whisper, a desperate plea for freedom. Edward frowned, hesitating. "Oh, Father, Eleanor thinks it's better if you don't expose yourself. With that cough you've been having and the unstable weather. It's for your own good, you understand. We don't want you to catch a cold." He avoided his father's gaze. "Besides, you know how she worries about the gardens. She doesn't want anything to be damaged." The last sentence was said in a tone of someone repeating something heard from another, but without questioning it. George's chest tightened. "But Edward, I just wanted a little sun, a little life." "She only wants your comfort, Father," Edward insisted, standing up. "You know, love is like that. Care. She told me she was cleaning up the water you spilled this morning. No one would do that for you, not with her dedication." He smiled, a smile George recognized as blind. "By the way, we have a very important dinner this weekend. Some investors are coming. Make sure you're well rested. Eleanor insists you make an appearance, even if it's just for a moment, to show that the family is united, you know." The icy air of Eleanor's suggestion that his presence was merely for show, a trophy of united family, hit George hard. It was a trap. To be there, exposed or not to be, and give Eleanor another reason to care for him in her own way. "Yes, son," George managed to murmur, resignation weighing on every syllable. "I'll be there." Edward nodded, satisfied, and left, the sound of his footsteps disappearing down the corridor. From the sill, Shadow observed the interaction. His black eyes, bright in the approaching dusk, seemed to focus on every nuance of Edward's voice, on the initial hesitation, on the repetition of Eleanor's words, on the blindness of his affection. The raven tilted his head, then with a precise and silent movement imitated Edward's timbre, whispering an almost perfect, "For your own good, you understand," followed by a hoarse croak that sounded strangely like Eleanor's melodic voice. "You know, love is like that. Care." The rehearsal continued, each day more refined. The stage, he knew, would soon be set. The days that followed the dinner announcement dragged for George with the torturous slowness of a broken clock. The promise of a united family gathering sounded in his ears like the toll of a funeral bell. The mansion, already a labyrinth of silence for him, now seemed to hold its breath, laden with a dark expectation. Eleanor, for her part, was in her element. The house bustled with the activity of hurried servants, arranging silver cutlery, polishing crystal, and preparing delicacies. She supervised everything with the precision of a maestro, her impeccable smile stretched for Edward, who watched her with blind admiration. For George, however, her glances were icy arrows, accompanied by veiled instructions. "Father George, make sure you're well rested for dinner," she said one day, her voice melodic, but her eyes fixed on the fragility of his hands. After all, a good impression is crucial. We don't want the investors to think the family has problems. The pause before the last word was an abyss of unspoken threats. "Your presence is very important to Edward, you understand? To show the strength of our union." George merely nodded, words trapped in his throat. He felt the weakness increasing, his energy draining with each day of confinement. The air seemed to suck his vitality, and the sight of the outside world through the window, where Shadow continued his silent vigil, was his only solace. The raven, indeed, was a constant presence. He perched on the sill, observing Eleanor's comings and goings, the moments when she bent down to whisper sharp instructions to her maid, or when her voice became sweet and persuasive for Edward. His black eyes captured every inflection, every nuance of the woman's duplicity. One morning, George heard a series of sounds coming from outside his window. A low croak, followed by a sound that made his hair stand on end. "Problems!" whispered a voice that imitated Eleanor's icy tone, but distorted by the bird's throat. Then, a strength of our union, with the false melody. Shadow was practicing, perfecting his performance for the approaching night. The raven was not just an observer, he was a recorder, a dark mirror of the cruelty unfolding. Edward, oblivious to this growing tension, was euphoric with the preparations. "Father, you'll see, Eleanor is an impeccable hostess," he exclaimed, entering George's room late in the afternoon, the day before the dinner. "She's thought of every detail. That's why I love her so much. She dedicates herself to everything, including you." He adjusted his father's pillow, not noticing the tremor in his arms. "Just try to look well tomorrow, okay? For me, for us." George felt a mixture of sadness and anger. Edward was so blind, so caught up in the image Eleanor projected, that he didn't see the man wilting before his eyes. He wanted to shout, to warn his son, but his voice betrayed him, and the fear of Eleanor's repercussions paralyzed his throat. That night, the mansion was invaded by the scent of lilies, Eleanor's favorite flowers, scattered throughout every room, suffocating the smell of mildew that George so detested. For him, the aroma was another sign of Eleanor's suffocating control. The day of the dinner finally arrived. George spent the morning in agonizing silence, trying to gather strength. Eleanor paid a visit to ensure he was presentable. "Be brief, father," she instructed, her voice low and incisive as she adjusted the collar of his shirt. "Just enough to be seen. And remember, smile. A smile works wonders." She leaned in, and an icy whisper brushed George's ear. "Don't ruin this for us, or the consequences will be unpleasant." Her blue eyes, previously icy, hardened like stone for a brief instant, revealing the ferocity hidden behind the mask of perfection. George felt a chill run down his spine. He was being led to the slaughter, a lamb adorned for display. But Shadow outside, on the windowsill, did not miss a single second of the scene. The raven tilted his head, his eyes fixed on the interaction, his ears sharp, registering the promise of unpleasant consequences, the cold instruction to smile. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains in George's room, bringing with it the aroma of lilies and the distant murmur of the mansion preparing to receive its guests. George closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that imminent night, a forced performance where he would be a mere extra in Eleanor's play. He didn't know it, but in the garden branches, Shadow repeated, in a hoarse and perfectly modulated croak, Eleanor's last words, rehearsing for the revelation that would change everything. George felt the fabric of the clean shirt brush against his aged skin, an uncomfortable reminder of the solemn occasion. The maid, the same young woman with downcast eyes, waited in silence at the door, a discreet ghost in her impeccable uniform. The silence of George's room, which had once been a prison, now seemed a refuge. He took a deep breath, trying to gather the little energy he had left, before following the mute invitation to the dining room. Upon emerging from the shadowy corridor, the mansion hit him like a wave of light and fragrance. The scent of lilies, now intense, hung in the air, mixing with the smell of fine food and the murmur of polite voices. The hall, usually grand, was transformed into a shimmering stage. Soft lights highlighted the crystal chandeliers and the gleaming silverware on the vast mahogany table. Eleanor, enveloped in a silk dress that accentuated her slender figure, was the center of attention. She floated among the guests, a radiant smile adorning her lips, her voice melodic and full of welcome. Edward, by her side, seemed to overflow with pride, presenting her as his greatest achievement. The guests, important investors in suits and ties, nodded and smiled, hypnotized by the aura of perfection the couple exuded. George was led to the head of the table, a place of honor that seemed more like a display throne. He sat, feeling the curious glances of the guests linger on him for an instant before returning to Eleanor and the lively conversation. He felt like an old piece of furniture, just part of the luxurious scenery. Hunger, long since distant, showed no signs of returning. "Father George, how good to see you among us tonight," Eleanor said, her voice reaching him like a caress. But her blue eyes, for a millisecond, met his with an icy warning. "The gentlemen were eager to meet you. It's so important to Edward to have the family united in moments like this." She smiled at the guests, who nodded in approval. "He worries so much about your well-being." The mention of his well-being by Eleanor in that tone of false concern made George's stomach churn. He tried to smile back, but his lips trembled. His throat was dry, and the sight of all that richly prepared food seemed to suffocate him. He noticed Shadow, the raven, defying the evening's etiquette, perched on the sill of the open window, his black eyes fixed on the scene inside. The animal was close enough to be a dark silhouette against the night sky, but his presence was undeniable. The conversation at the table flowed, centered on future projects and the success of Edward's business. Eleanor inserted herself with insightful comments, showing herself to be an intelligent and dedicated partner. She was, in the eyes of the guests, and Edward, the personification of perfection. "Eleanor is truly the force behind all of this," one of the investors commented, raising his glass. "A remarkable woman," Edward toasted, his face radiant. "She is everything to me and to the family. I don't know what we'd do without her care, especially with Father. She dedicates herself to everything, you understand?" He turned to George with an affected smile. "She told me she was cleaning up the water you spilled this morning. No one would do that for you, not with her dedication." The words, repeated almost verbatim from Eleanor's, hit George like an invisible whip. He felt the blush on his face, the public humiliation, even if veiled. The lie about the spilled water, an invention of Eleanor's to justify her care. George clenched his hands under the table, shame and fury battling against his exhaustion. He saw Eleanor's eyes gleam with silent triumph. She leaned slightly towards him, her voice soft, almost a whisper that only he could hear above the murmur. "Don't ruin this for us, Father. A smile works wonders, or the consequences will be unpleasant." It was at that instant, as Eleanor's icy warning hung in the air like an invisible mist, that a hoarse, harsh sound echoed from the window, a croak, but not the common croak of a bird. It was an almost perfect imitation, though distorted, of the words Eleanor had just uttered. Unpleasant. The sound cut through the air like a blade. Voices abruptly ceased. Glasses that were being raised stopped midway. All eyes turned to the window, where Shadow was perched, his head tilted. The raven, with a malicious glint in his black eyes, opened his beak again. "Smile. Don't ruin this." Shadow's voice was now a longer, more elaborate copy, a ghostly echo of Eleanor's instructions, interspersed with the bird's deep croak. Eleanor's false melody, distorted by the raven's throat, was unmistakable. The silence that followed was not merely the silence of shock, but that of an abrupt revelation. Edward, who seconds before had been smiling, watched his face contort in confusion, then in an incredulity that quickly turned to horror. His eyes, previously blinded by passion, now fixed on Eleanor, then on the raven, then on his father. Eleanor's mask of perfection began to crack, and a pale terror invaded her countenance. The air in the room was heavy, dense with the newly exposed truth. Eleanor's cruel play had found its most improbable and devastating actor. The silence that fell upon the hall was so dense it seemed to suck the air from their lungs. Glasses remained suspended. The soft music of conversation dissolved into an inaudible whisper. The guests, previously immersed in a world of business and cordiality, alternated their gazes between the raven at the window, whose black eyes shone with a disturbing intelligence, and Eleanor, whose face, once perfect, now displayed the pallor of shock. Edward, contorted in his chair, felt ice spread through his veins. The initial confusion gave way to an overwhelming wave of disbelief. What had his ears just witnessed? Eleanor's words, uttered moments before, now echoed, grotesquely distorted by the bird's throat, but undeniably hers. He looked at Eleanor, seeking an explanation, a denial, anything that could reconstruct the image he so loved. But her mask, once impenetrable, trembled, revealing a raw terror. What was that noise? Eleanor tried, her voice a thin, vibrating string, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She gestured towards the window, as if the raven were a mere nuisance. A bird. They're so unpredictable, aren't they? Always making strange noises. But no one moved, no one laughed. The attempt to divert attention was a humiliating failure. The guests, though hesitant, began to exchange bewildered glances. The air of perfection that enveloped the evening dissolved into a haze of discomfort. George, at the head of the table, felt a wave of weakness, followed by a surge of adrenaline. The truth, his truth, was there, exposed by a raven. Eleanor's humiliation was palpable, but George's triumph was a silent feeling, almost painful in its intensity. He saw his son, his dear Edward, turn to him, his eyes filled with agonizing confusion. "Father!" Edward's voice was a thread, laden with a sudden urgency. What did Shadow mean?" Those words. They were Eleanor's words. I heard them. Eleanor, seeing her plan crumble, stepped forward, a desperate move to regain control. "Edward, don't be ridiculous. It's a bird. Birds imitate sounds. There's nothing sinister about it." Her voice rose a pitch, the forced melody failing. The raven, as if understanding the imminent danger, tilted his head again. A deep, hoarse croak filled the silence. "Problems." Shadow's voice was now clearer, more defined, a chillingly accurate imitation of Eleanor's icy intonation when she whispered orders. Strength, union. And then the last words George had heard from his daughter-in-law, with the falsely sweet melody, materialized in the air. Smile. Don't ruin this for us. Unpleasant. Each word, a hammer blow to Eleanor's facade, each intonation irrefutable proof. Edward felt his world collapse. Those phrases, they were the same ones he had heard from Eleanor in contexts that before he interpreted as care and concern. The strength of our union was always accompanied by a veiled demand. The problems were always his father's failings. And the threat of unpleasant consequences now revealed itself in its true, cold nature. He looked at his father, whose aged face was marked by exhaustion and a deep sadness. Edward saw the tremor in George's arms, the almost imploring look. The memory of his thin, pale father contrasted brutally with the image Eleanor painted of a capricious, negligent old man. Eleanor. Edward's voice was a muffled thunder. What is this? What have you been doing to my father? His eyes, once blinded by passion, now burned with the flame of unbearable betrayal. Anger, cold and calculated, began to form, replacing confusion. Eleanor recoiled a step, her attempted smile completely shattered. Her lips trembled, and her eyes, once icy, now shone with undisguised panic. The banquet, the celebration, the meticulously constructed image, everything crumbled under the weight of the truth uttered by the throat of a bird. The perfect night had transformed into a stage for her own ruin. The meticulously arranged perfection of the night dissolved, leaving sharp fragments of truth scattered across the grand dining hall. Eleanor, cornered, felt the weight of converging gazes upon her, each an invisible dagger. Panic, once contained beneath a thin layer of charm, erupted, disfiguring her face. She tried to speak, but the words choked in her throat, transforming into a sharp hiss that bore no resemblance to her melodic voice. Edward, standing abruptly, scraped his chair across the floor, a jarring sound that echoed in the deadly silence. His eyes, once loving, now burned with a glacial fury, fixed on Eleanor. The raven's revelation was not just a sound, it was the key that unlocked an archive of memories, recontextualizing every word, every gesture of his wife. The spilled water from the morning, the exaggerated care, the unpleasant consequences she whispered about his father. Everything fit together, a dark constellation he had refused to see. "What have you done, Eleanor?" Edward's voice was low, dangerously controlled, but laden with a force that had never before been directed at her. His guests, the investors who minutes ago had praised her, now stirred, some picking up their glasses, others rising with a hurried excuse about an important call. The embarrassment was palpable, the business atmosphere shattered. Eleanor, trying to compose herself, forced a trembling smile. "Edward, darling, don't be naive. It's a trick, an unfortunate coincidence. The raven. He must have heard something in the garden, or—" She gestured frantically, searching for an escape, but her words sounded empty, desperate. "Your father, he's always been so dramatic. Perhaps he taught the bird, yes, to embarrass us." Her eyes flashed towards George, a vile accusation. George, observing everything from the head of the table, felt an overwhelming weariness. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a strange calm. The truth was out. His son, finally, was seeing. He met Edward's gaze, a gaze that now sought the truth, no longer the image. A subtle tremor ran through George's body, a mixture of relief and fear for what was to come. The raven, Shadow, still perched on the sill, let out a long, drawn-out croak, almost a lament. "Lies!" the distorted voice echoed, followed by a sibilant shh sound. a perfect imitation of the silence Eleanor imposed on George. A shiver ran down everyone's spine. Edward stepped forward, his hand raised, stopping Eleanor before she could say anything more. "Enough! I heard it, Eleanor. I heard the words. Not just now, but before. The insinuations, the veiled threats. You always said you were caring for my father, but I saw him waste away. I saw him pale, frightened." His voice rose, control slipping, pain and anger mixing. "That incident with the water, do you remember? You told me he had spilled water and that you cleaned everything up, and with such dedication. But now I understand. The dedication was to manipulate me, to make me believe in your sanctity while you tormented him." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, tears of despair, not remorse. "No, Edward, you're being unfair. I love you. I love your family. I only wanted the best for all of us." She reached out to him, pleading, but Edward recoiled as if her hand were on fire. "The best? The best for whom, Eleanor? For you, for your plans? My father, my own flesh and blood, was suffering under my roof, and I was blinded by your charade." He clenched his fists, his jaw locked. Eleanor's mask of perfection not only cracked, it shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing the cold, calculating woman Shadow had always known. The gala night had turned into an impromptu courtroom, where the verdict was undeniable. Edward's fortune now seemed insignificant compared to the mountain of guilt that crushed him. He turned to the guests, his face disfigured by shame and rage. "The party's over," he growled, his voice resonating with newfound authority. "Get out, all of you, now!" The silence was broken by a chorus of scraping chairs, the clinking of abandoned cutlery, and the hurried murmur of apologies. The guests, relieved for an excuse to escape that social nightmare, rushed for the exit, leaving behind the cold opulence of the mansion, the family drama exposed in its rawest form. The front door slammed shut, reverberating through the house, leaving behind only Edward, Eleanor, George, and at the window the vigilant silhouette of Shadow. The game was over, and the consequences this time would truly be unpleasant. A sepulchral silence descended upon the room, far more oppressive than the previous tumult. The echo of the front door, slamming shut for the last time, dissipated, leaving only the air heavy with the newly revealed truth. The crystal glasses, silver cutlery, and fine plates lay on the table, mute witnesses to a disaster that no wealth could mask. Edward remained motionless for an instant, his silhouette tense against the flickering lights of the chandelier. Then he slowly turned to Eleanor, his eyes, once blinded by passion, now burned with an unforgiving light. Eleanor, alone with them, could no longer maintain the forced smile. Panic was a cold wave that crept up her spine, paralyzing her. She tried to retreat, but the massive table blocked her way. Her eyes darted to the raven at the window, then to George, seeking an external enemy to blame, an escape for her desperate mind. "Eleanor!" Edward's voice was a dangerous whisper, stripped of any warmth. "What have you done? What have you done to my father?" He took a step, then another, closing the distance between them. Each step was a hammer striking the illusion he had built around her. I haven't done anything, Edward. It's all a misunderstanding. Your father, he's always been so difficult, so prone to..." The words choked in her throat. There was no longer an audience for her performance, only Edward's burning eyes and George's heavy gaze. George, exhausted, felt every muscle in his body ache, but a spark of dignity, a long-forgotten strength began to shine in his gaze. He could finally breathe, could finally be seen. Lies. Shadow's croak filled the silence again, a grotesque imitation of Eleanor's melodic voice, followed by the sibilant shh that his daughter-in-law used to silence him. The sound of the raven sealed the fate of Eleanor's words. Edward stopped, a step away from her, his face contorted in a mask of pain and fury. Lies? Is that what you've been giving me, Eleanor? Lies and manipulation, while my father wasted away under your care? I saw the marks of exhaustion on him, the pallor, the fear in his eyes when you were around. I ignored it. I defended you. His voice rose, a contained roar that made the crystals on the table tremble. Eleanor collapsed. The tears that now flowed were of genuine despair, but for herself, not for the suffering of others. I love you, Edward. I only wanted the best for us. I wanted a better life for you, for me, your father. He was an obstacle. He didn't understand us. Obstacle. Edward grabbed her shoulders, not with violence, but with an intensity that made her flinch. My father is my blood, my flesh, and you treated him like a parasite. You isolated him, you threatened him. I heard it, Eleanor. I heard the raven. Your words echoed in my mind for days, but I was blind for you, blinded by your beauty, by your image of a perfect wife. And he suffered in silence. He released her abruptly as if she burned him. He turned to George, who watched him with a mixture of apprehension and surprising stillness. The anger in Edward began to give way to an overwhelming guilt, a shame that gnawed at him from within. He had been the guardian, the protector, and he had failed miserably. Father. Edward's voice broke, a fragile thread. He took a step towards George, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his own negligence. I'm so sorry. I was a fool. George merely nodded slightly, his eyes moist. There was no reproach, only the shared pain of an old wound that was finally beginning to heal. It was a nod of tacit forgiveness, a mutual understanding that transcended words. Edward felt a tremor run through his body. He turned again to Eleanor, the decision in his eyes cold and unwavering. "Get out of my house, Eleanor," he said, each word a dry blow. "Take what's yours and leave. Now." Eleanor gasped, incredulous. "What? No! Edward, you can't do this! I'm your wife! I have rights!" "You had my trust, Eleanor. You had my love. And you destroyed them. There's nothing here for you, except the consequences of your actions. Go." The authority in his voice was absolute, unquestionable. Shadow, as if the scene were complete, let out a final, long, satisfied croak, before silently moving away from the windowsill, disappearing into the darkness of the night. The game was over, and the board was empty, awaiting a new beginning for some, and a bitter end for others. Edward, for the first time in a long time, felt a glimpse of clarity, but the road ahead would be long and painful. Eleanor staggered backward, hitting the table with a dull thud, her eyes wide with terror and fury. "No, Edward, you can't. This is absurd. This house is mine. I'm your wife. You can't just discard me like this." Her sharp voice broke the heavy silence, echoing in the ornate walls, a desperate cry from someone who saw her empire crumble. Edward didn't blink. The clarity that had invaded him was a cold, sharp blade, cutting through all his old illusions. "You lost the right to call yourself my wife the moment you decided to torment my father under my own roof. You have no place here, Eleanor. Not now, not ever again." His voice was tempered steel, leaving no room for negotiation. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers tightening around the device. "I'm calling security to escort you out, and tomorrow my lawyer will contact you to begin divorce proceedings." The sound of the security threat made Eleanor tremble. Her facade of confidence completely collapsed, revealing the terrified woman underneath. She had no escape plan for this scenario. "Edward, please, think of everything we've built. Think of the image. What will people say? Are you going to throw everything away because of a bird and the ramblings of a senile old man?" She shot a furious glance at George, whose silent presence was a condemnation. George, watching the scene from his place, felt a weight gradually being removed from his shoulders. The pain was still there, deep and significant, but now it was accompanied by an almost palpable relief. He didn't say a word, allowing Edward to confront the woman who had manipulated them for so long. Seeing her mask fall was a bitter but necessary victory. Edward's phone rang loudly in the silence, and he brought the device to his ear without taking his eyes off Eleanor. "Yes, I need security to come to the dining room immediately." Eleanor's panic reached its peak. She wouldn't wait to be dragged out. "You'll regret this, Edward. I swear you will. I won't let this go easily." With a scream of rage and humiliation, she ran for the staircase, her heels clattering on the polished marble as she ascended to the bedroom, probably to grab what she could before being expelled. The sound of hurried footsteps and a door slamming upstairs indicated her fury. Edward heard the sounds, but showed no emotion. He lowered the phone, turning to his father. The anger that had propelled him began to give way to deep exhaustion and shame. His eyes met George's, and the hardness in his face softened into an expression of profound sadness. "Father." Edward's voice was now a hoarse whisper, laden with guilt. He approached the head of the table, stopping before George. I don't know what to say. I failed you. Failed miserably." He extended a trembling hand, resting it on his father's wrinkled hand that lay on the table. George's skin was cold, thin as paper. George looked at his son's hand, then at his face, contorted with pain. A weak, tired but genuine smile appeared on his lips. He squeezed Edward's hand lightly. "You're here now, my son. That's what matters." George's voice was weak, but carried the wisdom of one who had waited a long time for this moment. There was no recrimination in his gaze, only an unwavering love. George's words were both a balm and a knife to Edward. Tears welled in his eyes, silently streaming down his face. He sank into the chair beside his father, his body bowed under the weight of his negligence. The truth had been painful, but his father's acceptance and tacit forgiveness were the most precious things he could have received. A moment of shared silence hung over them, broken only by the distant sound of voices at the front door, likely security arriving. Edward composed himself, wiping away his tears. There was still much to be done, many wounds to be healed, but for the first time in years, he felt he was on the right path. Eleanor's game was over, and George and Edward's game to rebuild trust and family was just beginning. The house seemed to breathe lighter air, an air of freedom, even if still heavy with the shadows of the past. The doorbell resonated through the mansion, a deep sound that seemed to break the palpable tension in the dining room. Hurried footsteps were soon heard in the marble corridor, and two uniformed security guards appeared at the door, their faces impassive. Edward stood up, his expression now somber and resolute, a stark contrast to the pain that had consumed him moments before. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. Mrs. Eleanor is upstairs. Please escort her out. Ensure she takes only her personal belongings. And please, no contact with the press or anyone else. Discretion is paramount." Edward's voice was firm, stripped of any hesitation. One of the guards nodded and, without a word, ascended the staircase. The other remained at the door, his eyes fixed on the stairs, waiting. A heavy silence descended upon the room again. A different silence, however. It was not the oppressive silence of fear, but the prelude to a still, fragile peace. From upstairs, muffled screams, raised voices, and the sound of objects being thrown were heard. Eleanor would not accept her departure gracefully. Her fury was a drum beating upstairs, but in the dining room, Edward and George remained motionless, like statues. They had endured the worst of her. Now it was merely the epilogue to a tyranny. Minutes later, Eleanor descended the staircase. Pulled by the security guard, her face red with rage and humiliation, her bloodshot eyes fixed on Edward, a venomous hatred burning in them. She carried a travel bag in one hand, clutching it tightly, and her hair was disheveled. She tried to break free, but the guard held her firmly. "You don't know what you've done, Edward. You'll regret this. I'll make sure your name is dragged through the mud, that everyone knows what a monster you are." Her sharp voice echoed, but it lacked its former power, sounding more like a desperate lament. Edward showed no emotion. He merely looked her in the eyes, the clarity in his gaze unwavering. "You are reaping what you sowed, Eleanor. Go, and don't come back." Eleanor was dragged out, her heels clattering furiously on the marble, her curses lost in the echo of the main hall. The sound of the door closing, firm and final, sealed the end of an era. A deep sigh escaped Edward's lips. He felt the weight of the world partially lifted from his shoulders, but exhaustion hit him like a wave. He turned to George, who watched him with a stillness that suggested deep meditation. The room, now silent, seemed wider, clearer. Eleanor's absence was almost a palpable character. "Father," Edward began, his voice soft, almost a murmur. He knelt beside George's chair, taking his father's wrinkled hands in his own. "I'm so sorry. So much time. How are you feeling?" George squeezed his son's hand, a faint warmth spreading through Edward's cold skin. "I'm tired, my son, but I'm here, and you are here." He paused, his eyes moist with emotion. "It's as if the air is cleaner, isn't it?" A weak but genuine smile lit up his face. "Shadow did a good job, a very good job." Edward nodded, a solitary tear tracing a path down his face. "He was the hero, and I was the fool, but no more." He looked at his father, the determination in his eyes stronger than ever. "We'll rebuild everything, Father. First, your health. I'll call a trusted doctor, someone you can be sure is on our side, and then we'll make this house your home again. Our home." George inclined his head, allowing his son's emotion to envelop him. It was an overwhelming relief, a balm for wounds he thought would never heal. He had resisted, endured, and now the light finally broke through. "Let's eat something, my son," George said, his voice a little stronger. "We haven't had a real meal in a long time." Edward smiled, a genuine smile he hadn't shown in years. "Yes, Father, let's eat, and tomorrow we start anew." He helped George to stand, the two men supporting each other, not just physically, but emotionally. The battle had been won, but the journey of healing was only just beginning. The mansion, once a stage of silent torture, now whispered promises of an uncertain future, but one filled with hope. As Edward helped George to stand, the silence of the dining room was an almost tangible presence, no longer suffocating, but filled with a delicate relief. The slow footsteps of the two men echoed on the polished marble as they left the room, each sound a note in a prelude to peace. Edward guided his father with a tenderness that had been absent for years, his arm strong and protective. George, though still frail, felt a renewed energy, a lightness that was not physical, but of the soul. The air seemed easier to breathe, Eleanor's invisible weight finally removed. They walked to the living room, where the fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the silk-lined walls. "Rest here, Father," Edward said, helping George to sit in a soft armchair. He knelt again, his eyes fixed on his father's, seeking forgiveness and healing. "I'll call Dr. Davies. He's an old friend, trustworthy. I'll ask him to come immediately." George nodded, a faint smile curving his lips. "Yes, my son. That's a good idea." His eyes drifted to the window, where the darkness of night still reigned, but he could feel the promise of dawn. Edward picked up the phone, his mind already racing with the list of urgent tasks. George's health was the top priority. As he dialed, he observed his father. The tension in his shoulders seemed to have lessened, and for the first time in a long time, George didn't seem to be shrinking into himself. The phone rang a few times before Dr. Davies answered, his voice sleepy. Edward explained the situation in general terms, the urgency in his tone unmistakable. The doctor, aware of the family's reputation, promised to be there in less than an hour. "He's coming, Father," Edward announced, putting away the phone. "And then we'll eat something. What would you like?" George looked at his son, emotion overflowing in his eyes. "Anything, my son, as long as it's prepared by someone who doesn't hate me." The lightness in his words was almost shocking, a sign that the old man's sense of humor was beginning to return. Edward felt a lump in his throat. The pain he had caused his father was a deep scar on his own soul. "I'll prepare it myself. If you like," he offered, a wavering smile. "Anything for you." However, before Edward could move, a rustle of wings broke the silence of the room. Shadow landed softly on the windowsill, his dark, intelligent eyes fixed on the two men. He let out a low caw, almost a murmur, as if approving the new order. George extended a trembling hand, and the raven tilted his head, accepting the gentle caress of the old man's finger. "He knows, doesn't he?" George whispered, his voice laden with affection. "He always knew." Edward sat on the rug at his father's feet, feeling the raven's presence as a silent guardian. "Yes, Father, he knew, and he saved us." The truth of that statement was overwhelming. If not for Shadow, Eleanor would still be there. Her shadow covering George's life. A deep sigh escaped Edward. He thought of Eleanor, her fury, her threats. The legal battle would be exhausting, but he was prepared. The image of her being dragged out of the house was still vivid in his mind, but there was no regret, only a cold, unwavering resolve. He would protect his father, whatever the cost. The soft scent of burning wood in the fireplace filled the room, bringing a sense of warmth and coziness. The house, once cold and oppressive, seemed to breathe again. The corridors that once whispered Eleanor's furtive footsteps and George's silent moans now seemed to await the sound of laughter and genuine conversation. The mansion's doorbell rang again, a softer touch this time, announcing the doctor's arrival. Edward stood up, feeling a new purpose in every step. The night was long, and the journey of healing even longer. But they were not alone. The past was behind them, and the future, though uncertain, was theirs to rebuild, brick by brick, from the rubble of Eleanor's manipulation. The promise of a home, of a restored family, was a bright beacon in the darkness. The main door opened, revealing a man with graying hair and spectacles perched on his nose, Dr. Davies. His face, marked by years of dedication to medicine and a sincere friendship with the family, expressed contained concern. Edward greeted him with a firm handshake, silent gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you for coming, Doctor. It's urgent. Don't worry, my son. Your father is my friend," the doctor replied, his voice calm and reassuring. He followed Edward to the living room, where George remained in the armchair, a fragile figure in the vastness of the room. Dr. Davies knelt beside George with the same tenderness Edward had shown. His experienced eyes scanned the old man's pale face and thin hands. An almost inaudible sigh escaped his lips. "George, my old friend, how do you feel?" George managed a weak smile. "Better now, Dr. Davies. Much better." The consultation began right there in the living room, far from the coldness of a clinic. The doctor asked a series of questions, checked his blood pressure, listened to his heart. Every movement was careful, every touch gentle. Edward watched, his heart aching. Every sign of George's fragility, a blow to his own guilt. He saw the extreme pallor, the shallow breathing, the eyes, though clearer, still laden with deep fatigue. Dr. Davies stepped back a little, turning to Edward with a grave look. "Edward, your father is exhausted, physically and mentally. There are clear signs of malnutrition and prolonged stress. He needs absolute rest, a nutritious diet, and psychological support. The scars are not just visible, some are invisible and take longer to heal." Edward nodded. the lump in his throat almost preventing him from speaking. "I'll do everything necessary, Doctor. The best professionals, the best nutrition, no limits." "I know you will," Dr. Davies replied, his voice softer. "But the most important thing now is peace. He needs to feel safe, loved, and he needs time, a lot of time." He handed over a prescription and some detailed instructions. "I'll be back tomorrow morning for a more complete checkup. For now, make sure he eats and sleeps without interruption." With a nod, the doctor departed, leaving a thoughtful silence in the room. Edward knelt again beside George, holding his hands. "Dr. Davies will take care of you, Father. And so will I." George closed his eyes for an instant, the image of his son's strong, protective hands contrasting with Eleanor's. "I know, my son, I know." Edward stood up, his mind already formulating plans. The kitchen was the next step. He headed to the room, a place he had rarely used in recent years. The mansion staff had already been instructed about Eleanor's departure and the new priority, George's well-being. A trusted chef had been called in a hurry. Moments later, a warm and nutritious broth was served in the living room. The aroma of fresh vegetables and herbs hung in the air, a comforting contrast to the oppressive smell that had once dominated the house. Edward helped his father take the first spoonfuls, a gesture of affection that George absorbed like a balm. Shadow, silent on his perch at the window, watched every movement, his eyes bright in the dim light. While George ate, Edward began to call his lawyers. Eleanor's fury still echoed in his mind, but he was prepared. He knew she would try to dismantle his reputation, perhaps even his empire. But he had the truth on his side, and the determination of a man who had just rescued his father from the abyss. The battle would be tough, but his focus now was George's recovery. "Tomorrow, Father, you'll go to the garden," Edward said, his voice full of promise, as he watched George finish the broth. "We'll enjoy the sun again, and I'll ask them to redecorate your room, just the way you like it." George looked at his son, a glimmer of genuine hope in his eyes. "That would be wonderful, my son. Wonderful." The night advanced, and the mansion, once a mausoleum of suffering, began to breathe in a new way. The silence, once heavy and oppressive, was now filled with the promise of healing and renewal. Edward knew the path would be long and difficult, but George's presence by his side and Shadow's watchful gaze were the driving force he needed to rebuild not just a house, but a family. The journey of healing was only just beginning, but the seed of hope had been planted. Edward helped George to rise from the armchair, his father's body lighter than he expected, as if the warm broth and words of affection had removed an invisible weight. "Let's go to your room, Father. You need to truly rest." The master bedroom, once a sanctuary of luxury where Eleanor reigned, was now empty, her belongings removed in a whirlwind of silent orders. Edward guided George to a spacious and cozy guest room with a view of the night garden and a soft bed, prepared with fresh cotton sheets. The scent of lavender and damp night dew entered through the slightly open window. "Tomorrow I'll call the decorators to redecorate your room, Father, exactly as you wish. But for now, this is the quietest place." Edward helped him lie down, his hand strong and gentle. George closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping his lips. It was not a sigh of pain, but of relief. "Thank you, my son," he whispered, his voice already firmer but still laden with fatigue, "for everything." Edward remained by the bed until he heard George's breathing become regular, sleep finally embracing his father. The door closed softly behind him, leaving George in a sleep that would be, for the first time in a long time, free of nightmares. In the living room, Shadow waited, perched on the fireplace, his eyes fixed on Edward. The raven let out a low caw like a silent question. "Don't worry, my friend," Edward replied, a murmur to the animal. "He'll be fine." The early morning hours dragged slowly. But Edward couldn't find rest. His mind buzzed with the list of tasks, the plans for the next day, and the inevitable shadow of the approaching battle. He sat at his desk, phone in hand. The first call was to his head of security, with clear instructions. Eleanor was not under any circumstances to approach the mansion again. The second to his principal lawyer, scheduling an urgent meeting for the early morning. He would dictate every step, every clause. Eleanor's fury still echoed in his mind, her threats empty of power. But now, he had a greater purpose. He would face her, but he would not allow her war to touch George. Dawn arrived, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. Edward had spent the night awake, but felt no fatigue. Adrenaline and determination propelled him. He had taken a cold shower and dressed, ready for the day ahead. Shortly after, the doorbell rang again, and it was Dr. Davies. The doctor, with a calmer demeanor, followed Edward to George's room. The old man was awake, looking out the window, a ray of morning sun already touching his face. "Good morning, George," Dr. Davies said, with a gentle smile. "Did you sleep well?" "Like an angel," George replied, his voice with a clarity that surprised Edward for the first time in years. The doctor performed a more thorough examination, carefully checking vital signs. His expression softened. "Your progress is remarkable, my friend. Rest and peace are already taking effect. We will continue with the nutritious diet and supplements, but the most important thing is to maintain this environment of tranquility." He turned to Edward. "He is responding well. He needs patience, yes, but the improvement is evident." Edward felt immense relief. "Thank you, doctor. I don't know how to thank you." "Caring for him is the best way," the doctor replied with a nod. "I'll be back in 2 days for another assessment. But for now, take him to the garden. The fresh air and sun will do wonders." As soon as Dr. Davies left, Edward helped George get dressed. The clothes were simple, but clean and comfortable. The morning sun bathed the garden in a golden glow, and the air carried the scent of roses. Shadow, as always, preceded them, perching on a branch of an old mulberry tree. Edward led George to a stone bench shaded by a blooming wisteria. George breathed deeply, his eyes closed for an instant, absorbing every sensation. The birdsong, the gentle murmur of the wind through the leaves, the warmth of the sun on his face. A solitary tear trickled down his cheek, but it was a tear of gratitude, not pain. "It's so beautiful," George whispered, his voice choked. "I had forgotten what the sun felt like." Edward sat beside his father, holding his hand. "You'll never forget again, father, I promise." He watched Shadow, who now faced them from his perch, his dark, deep eyes seeming to approve the scene. The raven let out a soft caw, almost a song. It was a melody of hope, a reminder that the darkness had been expelled. The morning advanced in a delicate peace, punctuated only by George's murmurs and Edward's careful gestures. The mansion, once a stage of silent cruelty, now resonated with the promise of a restored life. The journey of healing would be long, but in that sunny garden, surrounded by the beauty of nature and the vigilance of a loyal raven, they knew that the seed of hope had sprouted. The days that followed were a balm for George. The morning sun found him in the garden, his skin gaining a healthier tone, his voice stronger. Edward fulfilled every promise. George's room was being meticulously redecorated, transformed into a refuge of peace, with light colors and comfortable furniture that George had personally chosen. The mansion, once a stage of tension, now resonated with low laughter and gentle conversations from the staff and Edward. Edward, for his part, worked tirelessly. His office had become a headquarters. Lawyers and security consultants came and went, discussing strategies. Eleanor's accounts were frozen. shared assets under meticulous investigation. Edward was determined to dismantle the web of lies and manipulations she had built. He knew Eleanor would not remain silent, that her wrath would be a force to be reckoned with. Shadow, the faithful raven, observed everything. From the sill of Edward's office window, he followed the meetings, his black eyes catching the seriousness on the men's faces. At night, he often perched on George's bedroom window, a silent guardian over the old man's peaceful sleep. George, in turn, seemed to draw comfort from the animal's presence, a mutual recognition of an inexplicable bond that the raven and the old man had forged. The calm, however, was only the surface of a turbulent ocean. Eleanor's first offensive came in the form of an elegant letter, delivered by a messenger at the main gate. Edward opened it with a paper knife, its sharp point like the threat he expected. It was not a letter of love, nor of plea. It was an ultimatum, written in an icy, calculating tone. Edward, Eleanor's impeccable cursive script seemed to mock him on the creamy paper. You have made a grave mistake. Do you think you can simply discard me? I have enough to destroy your reputation, your legacy. Think of what this will do to your contracts, to your investors, and to your beloved father. His illness could be much more convenient for me. Do not doubt my ability to make your life an even greater hell. Edward crumpled the letter, the paper rustling with the force of his contained anger. Eleanor's coldness was palpable, her contempt for George nauseating. He threw the crumpled paper into a metal wastebasket, which made a dry sound as it was hit. Reinforce security, he instructed his head of security by phone, his voice firm and sharp. No one, absolutely no one, approaches the mansion without my express permission. That same day, during lunch, George brought up the subject in a firmer voice than Edward expected. My son, he said, as Shadow watched from the kitchen doorway, his eyes fixed on Edward. I know you are fighting for me, but don't forget yourself. Don't let that woman consume you. Edward nodded, touched by his father's concern. I won't, Father, but I need to ensure she never hurts us again. He thought of something that could bring a little normalcy, a sign of victory against adversity. How about a dinner, a family dinner, just us and a few close relatives, to celebrate your recovery and the peace we've finally found? George thought for a moment, a slight smile forming on his lips. How long has it been since we had a real dinner, hasn't it? Shadow, perched on the doorway, let out a long, hoarse caw, as if agreeing with the idea. His eyes, once merely observant, now seemed to carry an intention, an anticipation. The raven knew that Eleanor's presence, or her threat, was not far off. The dinner would be more than a celebration. It would be a stage, and he, Shadow, was ready for his role. Edward didn't know how close he was to the truth. He saw the smile on his father's face, the rekindled hope, and felt a pang of determination. The dinner would be in a few days, a silent declaration that life in the mansion was returning to its course, free from Eleanor's shadow. But darkness, he knew, still lurked, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike again. The days leading up to the dinner vibrated with a contained energy in the mansion. The staff worked diligently, the kitchen exuded tempting aromas, and the long, imposing dining table was adorned with fresh flowers and gleaming tableware. George, with flushed cheeks and a renewed sparkle in his eyes, observed the preparations from the garden, closely accompanied by Edward. His father's recovery was a daily miracle, each smile, each firm word, a testament to the peace he had found. Edward, however, did not relax. Calming the surface required effort, for the depths still held turbulent currents. His decision to invite Eleanor to dinner under strict security conditions surprised everyone, including his lawyers. She needs to face what she did, he had explained, his voice cold and determined. And the truth needs to come out, not just for us, but for the family she tried to deceive. Shadow, like a diligent spectator, followed every move. His cause, once mysterious, now seemed to carry a melody of anticipation. The Raven knew the stage was set, and the curtain was about to rise. That night, the mansion received the few close relatives Edward had invited. The atmosphere was one of forced warmth, tension, a silent presence that hung over the silver cutlery and sparkling crystal. George sat at the head, Edward by his side, protecting him with his mere presence. The guests, for the most part, avoided the topic of Eleanor, conversing about pleasantries with noticeable nervousness. Shadow, punctually, made his appearance, perching on the marble fireplace, his black eyes sweeping the room like a silent jury. Then, a soft creak from the main door announced Eleanor's arrival. She entered, discreetly escorted by two of Edward's security men, who remained motionless near the entrance. Eleanor wore an impeccable silk dress, a calculating smile playing on her lips. Her icy eyes met Edward's, a tacit challenge in her gaze. "Darling, what a delightful surprise," she said, her voice a soft false honey that made George's skin crawl. "I thought I was no longer welcome." Edward did not offer her a smile. "You have 10 minutes, Eleanor, to apologize to my father and leave. Otherwise, the consequences will be irreversible." Eleanor's mask slipped for an instant, revealing a flash of contained fury before she pulled it back. She walked to the table, stopping in front of George, who shrank slightly in his seat. "George," she said, a condescending tone in her voice, "I hope you're enjoying the drama you've created, always so melodramatic." George did not respond, merely fixed his eyes on his daughter-in-law. Eleanor, feeling in control, let out a low, scornful laugh. "You know, Edward, it's a shame your father is so stubborn. We could have avoided all this if he had simply cooperated. He's a burden, isn't he? Old, sick, useless, almost a nuisance." She leaned in, as if to whisper something only to George, but her voice carried an icy echo that the entire room caught. "Give up your assets, old man, or you'll rot here. Edward is blind. He'll never believe you." A shiver ran through the room. The guests exchanged startled glances. Edward clenched his fist under the table, anger boiling in his veins. It was then that Shadow moved. The Raven tilted his head, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. A hoarse caw escaped his beak, and then, with chilling clarity, he imitated Eleanor's voice. Not just the voice, but the intonation, the accent. "You stubborn old man. Give up your assets, or you'll rot here. Edward will never believe you." The room plunged into a sepulchral silence. The voice, identical to Eleanor's, reverberated, laden with all the coldness and contempt she had directed at George countless times. The relative's eyes widened, horrified. George, in turn, looked up, a tear tracing a path down his face, but not of pain, but of relief and gratitude. Edward felt his blood run cold, then boil. The veil of years of blindness fell in an instant, torn apart by the undeniable proof Shadow had brought. The words, the gestures, the manipulation, everything fit into a heinous pattern. He turned to Eleanor, his face hardened by a controlled but absolute fury. Eleanor, pale and wide-eyed, tried to compose herself. "This is absurd. A bird. What is this, Edward? A bad joke?" But Edward no longer heard her. The truth was a hammer striking his conscience. He stood up, his voice low, but laden with unquestionable authority. "Remove her. Now." He gestured to the security guards, who promptly approached Eleanor. "She will never set foot in this mansion again, and the legal consequences, they will be severe." Eleanor tried to fight, cursing and threatening, but she was firmly escorted out. Her screams echoed through the corridors, diminishing until they disappeared with the closing of the door. Silence returned, but now it was a silence of shock and painful truth. Edward turned to George, kneeling beside his father's chair, holding his trembling hands. "Father, forgive me. he whispered, his voice choked with emotion and guilt, for being so blind, for not seeing. George squeezed his son's hand. "You see now, my son, and that's all that matters." A smile, George's first truly light smile in years, bloomed on his lips. Shadow let out a long, soft caw from the fireplace, almost a whisper of satisfaction. Justice had been served, not by swords or by laws, but by the truth brought by an unexpected creature. The darkness had been expelled from the mansion, and light, finally, had returned to stay. Edward's mansion was no longer a stage of silent cruelty, but a home where a father's healing and a son's redemption could, at last, flourish.